Welcome to Next in Queue, the podcast for contact center and customer experience professionals. Next in Queue is brought to you by Happy 2 Vision. Eliminate blind spots and see right through every conversation with Happy 2 Vision. Learn more at ajppitu.com. Now, here's your host, Rob Dwyer.
Welcome, everyone, to another episode of Next in Queue. My name is Rob Dwyer, and I am so excited to be joined today by, author, blogger, podcaster, CX enthusiast, and aspirant punk, Adrian Swinscoe. Adrian, welcome to the show. How are you?
I'm very well, Rob. I'm very well. And yeah, that's a kind of a long list. I guess I keep adding things. I'm a bit like a tree, sort of like it adds rings as I get older, sort of thing.
Yeah, you have absolutely been adding a lot of things to your list. When I go down just to look at, and I left a lot of things off the list. I could have added a lot more for sure. So,
well, no, I was going to say, oh, God, I just kicked my table, and then it made me wobble. That wasn't an earthquake, folks. That was just me kicking my table. But yeah, funny. Thank you for having me on and speaking to your audience. And it's always a pleasure to meet new folks, talk to new people and things, because I think I'd add a couple of things onto that kind of list. There's one, I am both an advocate and an agitator for better outcomes, both for customers and for people that serve customers. And so that's what I'm all about.
Yeah, I love that. I actually ran across you from a mutual contact of ours, David Powers, and he sings your praises, I think literally in a punk voice. And so maybe a little more metal for David, but that's how I came across one of your books, Punk CX. You've written a number of books. But I actually, before we talk about that stuff, I'd like to know, how did you get into this? Because obviously we don't all start in CX. You've been doing this for a long time, but take us back. Where are you from, and how did you first get into this business?
So first of all, I'm going to tell you something, and then I have to ask for your forgiveness. And because the reason I'm going to do that is because I'm an economist by training. And so you have to kind of forgive me for that. And I'm also a teacher by training. And I did both of those things in the early part of my career, both kind of here in the UK, but also kind of overseas. I spent a lot of time in the Middle East, predominantly in Cairo, in Egypt, which was super cool. Started off teaching, and then I started working in sort of economic development type sort of work. And that was across the 90s. And then as I got to the end of the 90s, I sort of flirted with the idea of becoming a professional economist, and that would require me taking a PhD. And I realized I didn't really have, I had the sort of the desire to do it. I didn't think I had the stamina to do it. So I switched tack and took an MBA, and then worked in the commercial world for a couple of big corporates for a few years, and then that up to 2004, and then I went sort of more independent, and then I started doing some stuff in and around the kind of corporate world, just kind of consulting sort of stuff. Now, then we got to the kind of point where around about 2008, 2009, I was a bit like, I like the idea of working independently, but I could see where the market was going. I've always had I feel like a knack of figuring out, seeing where the lay of the land is, and actually understanding kind of where things I think are going. And it seemed to me that if you wanted to work independently, you have to develop a digital footprint, and you have to, the way I like to describe it is, you have to be able to develop trust at a distance. People have to be able to get to know you before they sort of almost actually talk to you like this, or contact you via email, or even call you on the phone or meet you face to face. And so I understood that. So I set up my own sort of site, my blog, and I started writing about sort of just general stuff. And that got very boring very quickly. And I sort of stopped and I reflected on what is it that what do I care about, or what do I don't like, and what do I want to change? And I thought about all the stuff that I'd done through my previous kind of parts of my kind of, if you like, work journey. I don't really have a career as such. I have a bunch of things that I've enjoyed doing, and that's kind of got me to here. And it struck me that I've always built or developed things that had sort of customer and employee value at their heart, as it were. They're done for a reason, and they have people kind of in mind. So they're built, they might leverage technology, but they're built for a need or a desire, kind of whatever it might be. And so I've always enjoyed that. And that made me think about like the ideas like, you know what, I don't really like bad service. Well, rather, I really don't like bad service, I should say. Now that doesn't make me any different to anybody else, but I was kind of reflected on that, and I said it's always frustrated me, being a bit of a student of how organizations do things, that often organizations get in the way of their people doing a good job. And so that for me was like my groove. I feel like that was the motivation that when we had a false start on the blog, that was the kind of the restart. Was like, right, fine, I don't like bad service. I'm going to explore what good and great looks like, with no fixed idea about where the end is going to be, no aspiration to be able to create a theory of everything or a model or a framework that's kind of, you know, could create another gold rush where I'm going to be the only kind of like shovel and pan seller. Nothing like that. I just wanted to learn. And I wanted to learn and share kind of ideas about that. So I started the blog, started writing about it, started speaking to people. I started doing this, like a podcast. I started my podcast back in 2011. So it's over, well, it's about 11 plus years old now. I've done 425 plus episodes. And the cool thing I found about that is that, one, it allows me to meet some amazing people and learn from them. The second thing is that it's like an R&D and L&D lab combined. Because I've always thought about either my podcast or writing and things is I've described it as my public thinking digital notebook. What it means is that I don't have to be right. The process of talking about this sort of stuff and thinking about it and writing it down means it helps me get clearer on what I think. And if that means that people find that useful and interesting, if I'm just trying to be useful and interesting and just explore and try and add value in things, then that'll find its own audience. I'm not trying to sell anybody anything. I'm trying to almost like advocate for those better outcomes. And so the blog started, and then the podcast started, and then I published I self-published a book as an anthology of stuff that I've done. And then I got approached by Forbes about 8 or so years ago. And they said, we like what you're doing. Would you like to write a column for us? I was like, what? Oh, yeah, okay. Because I thought that gives me this halo of credibility. Oh, he knows what he's talking about. I'm like, I'm really just making it up. I'm just a little bit further down the road than you are. And it's gone on from there. And then I published another book in 2016 with kind of Pearson's called How to Wow. And that was great because that was like grown-up publishing. Somebody else wanted to publish your book, and that did really well. And I learned a lot through that. And then latterly I published the sort of the punk books, was the Punk CX in 2019 and the Punk XL, which came out late last year. And those were kind of a departure from standard business books because it was born out of frustration, but also a way of trying to engage with people in a different way, but also kind of fuses my love of punk music, but also kind of with the kind of a domain that I'm really interested in. But it kind of cuts through because it gets to the point where people are like, oh, that's interesting. What's that all about? And then you tell them and they're like, oh, okay. and then you can explore it and things and do it. And in many ways, I call the books, they're like art projects, like art or like an album. You don't have to like it. That's fine. You don't have to like all of it. That's fine too. I mean, which albums do you like that you like 3-4 tracks on the album and some of the rest of them are like, they're filler, right?
Yeah.
It's normal. And so that's where I've kind of gotten to, and over the kind of course of time that I've been able to develop that digital footprint, as it were, that trust at a distance. And now I get asked to do all sorts of stuff, like whether it's advisory or speaking or webinars or kind of workshops or whatever it might be. And so it allows me to concentrate on doing the stuff I really like and not do the stuff that I don't really like. I don't really like sales and marketing and all of that sort of stuff. So I create this stuff, and then it's created a sort of a bit of a magnet sort of thing that kind of things come to me, and I get to choose what I want to do. And that doesn't make me a super rich guy, or rather super wealthy guy, but it makes me feel quite rich, if you know what I mean, in that I have choice and control about what I do, and I do not take that for granted. And I'm so pleased about where we've gotten to, because particularly from my wife's perspective, because when I started off this kind of writing, blogging kind of journey, she would go out and meet some friends and they'd be like, "Oh, where's Adrian?" And she would like roll her eyes. She's like, "He's blogging again." Because she didn't quite get it. I didn't quite get it. I didn't really know where I was going, but I was like, "I'm going to go down that road." And off we went. And she's like, "Where are you going?" But we are now she gets it. She understands kind of what it is and the value of it. And so, yeah, I tell you what I found is, like, I think it was late last year, I found the best way of describing kind of what I do is that I am in service to service.
I love that. I hear you say you don't really like sales and marketing, and yet, as I was reading Punk CX, about halfway through, I was like, this book reminds me of reading a Seth Godin book, who's all about marketing. And then I think actually in the book you reference Seth Godin at one point as well. Yeah. Was he a big influence on you?
So yeah, I love Seth's work. He is like, he's got a brain the size of a planet. It's quite remarkable. And some of the stuff he's done is amazing. And he's a machine as well. He just keeps going. And I had the pleasure of meeting him a couple of times and having him on the podcast a couple of times, and I've supported a couple of his kind of projects and things. And so he's a brilliant guy and very generous with his kind of time and when things intersect and stuff. And yes, he has been an inspiration to me. But in a way that, and somebody so beautifully kind of described me, and I don't really deserve it, but they described me as like, the Seth Godin of the experience world. And I'm like,
yeah,
that's a bit of a high bar. I don't know if I deserve that, but I've tried to almost take what he's kind of done and almost apply it in my kind of own way and put my own sort of flavor kind of on it.
Yeah, no, I definitely see that. I hadn't heard that, but as I was going through the book, that was the feeling I got. One of the things that I think, and I highly recommend everyone go grab Punk CX and Punk XL. You can't miss the cover. Yeah, they're gorgeous covers too. Very eye-catching.
And I'm just going to tell you, just as a teaser, this is one you won't have seen. It's like this. This is the hardcover limited edition of Punk CX. It's the original concept. It's 7" by 7". As an homage to the single, to the vinyl single.
Yeah, I can totally see it. I love it.
Just way too expensive to produce in such a beautiful thing, but I've got some of them. And if people wanted to email me nicely, and kind of like the request kind of like, request one or request whether you can. I'll tell you what I'll do. If a couple of people kind of like on listening to this can reach out and say, I heard you talking about that, I would love to get a hard copy of that Punk CX hardcover, then I will ship one to you. I'll ship two to people. You get to choose, Rob, and I will
love
ship
it.
two to people anywhere in the world.
I absolutely love it. So we'll absolutely do that. That's a fantastic offer. Very generous of you. So as I'm going through this, I just want to kind of set the stage. Part of what why I felt like I heard some echoes of Seth in this is I always hear Seth talking about really finding your audience, your least viable audience, right? Just find your people. And I felt like you were very much doing that with this book. You were speaking to a very specific audience who wanted to listen and wanted to engage. And the book probably raised more questions than it answered, which I loved. And it seemed, as you put, right, inspired by punk, because as you go through this, you're putting thoughts out there, and some things you go very fast. That's the other thing. This is an incredibly fast read if you want it to be. I mean, it is, it's a 3-chord masterpiece for sure.
Thank you.
But you can dig in and also spend a lot of time on individual bits of it and pieces that really resonate with you. And I really loved that. When you were going through the process of writing any of your books, what was the hardest part that you really just didn't expect to be difficult?
That's what a great question. So I think the hardest part is because I guess what I find is that my books I write in series. So I'm writing kind of all the time. I've had a bit of a hiatus over the last couple of months because we've gone through a bit of a house and city move. We've gone through a house and city move. And so that's just kind of like squeeze bandwidth to net zero. And I'm starting to get back on it now that we're settled again. What I'm always doing is I'm always writing in series. There's always like all these breadcrumbs of ideas that are always laid out across the weeks and the months and the years. And so they're all there. It's but when you get to a point where you go, the books are almost like a greatest hits over a period. So you've got all these ideas, and then it's the case of that you're looking and go, how does that all fit together? And what fits and what doesn't fit. And it's almost like choosing, they're sort of threshing through stuff and going, not that, maybe that with that, that's a standalone thing. And then there's all these kind of, so sometimes it's the choice of kind of making it's there's difficult choice about paring stuff down and going, that I don't think that works. I don't think that stands up. I think that's a good point. It's interesting, but it doesn't fit with the broader sort of like theme. And so, that for me, that's the hardest kind of like part, is almost like you end up deciding what is going to get left on the cutting room floor. And that's the hard part. And then there's the other kind of part around when you pull it all together, particularly these punk books, is you're pulling it all together, and it's like sweating the words so that you end up with the right sort of tempo and the right sort of cadence. So it's a bit like it's got to feel in tune with it. You can, maybe you can drop off the sort of pace, but it's got to be the same sort of thing. So it's like, I can, you'll know this. It's like going, I'm either going to tell you something and then you do with it what you will, or I'm going to raise something or I'm going to ask you some questions. Because the book it's not about answers. Punk was never about providing answers. Punk was about raising issues and agitating for change, for better. He's like, Henry Rollins was once quoted, he of, Black Flag and the Rollins band, and also, friend of pretty much everybody. He also says punk is, when asked what punk was about, he says punk means question everything. And I think that's the point. It's about looking for better and about questioning sort of stuff.
I've felt that so much in reading the book. There were some pieces of this that really stuck out to me, and I should just warn everybody right now, there's going to be some language. Because sometimes when you're agitating, there's some language, and I actually really love that you used and this actually was part of the book, right? Talking about the language, the words that we use, but you were very pointed in your language and kind of raising attention with some choice words. One of the things that really stuck out to me is customer experience is about more than fucking metrics.
No, that way. Poster above there that was inspired by that one. And yes. And because, it's that sort of idea. That poster has a big shout out to the folks that there's a guy called Mark Stickdorn in Vienna in Austria who runs a company by the name of More Than Metrics, and they give me permission to put the book in, to put that poster in the book. And I think it's just brilliant. But it's true. It's almost a bit like, if you think about, if you go to anybody who's in charge of a customer experience program or is in a professional or is interested or studying it or whatever, go like, oh, customer experience. And they go like, what does customer experience mean at your organization? Or just tell me about customer experience at your organization. And within that, metrics will come up. And you look at it and just go, and sometimes it gets reduced down to metrics, but then you get into the kind of point where people kind of get into scientific management and people talk about, what gets measured gets managed, and what you measure sort of thing. And I think that's fair enough, but it shouldn't just be about the metrics, because this is what we're dealing with. There's another kind of point where it's similar to this, but it's like, if you ask the question, what's the difference between customer experience in an organization and the customer's experience? And I say in the book kind of slightly flippantly, well, technically, the difference between customer experience and the customer's experience is, the difference technically is probably 4 letters and an apostrophe.
Says the Economist.
Right. But in real life, the difference between customer experience in an organization and the customer's experience is sometimes can be a country mile. And it's almost this idea that customers are not at the heart of what we can do in our decision making and our thinking and things. And when you start talking about, oh, this customer gave us an NPS of X and Y, okay, is that the way that you describe your granny? Is your granny a barcode or a score on a Likert scale? I mean, like, it's, so I think what we lose sight of is we lose sight of the human beings. And we forget the idea that despite all the processes and the systems and the technology and everything else, people are at the end of all these processes. People make them, people buy their stuff, and there's everything else in between. And when we reduce people down to just numbers and wallet share and all these different sort of things, we sort of dehumanize the relationship that we say we want to build with customers. And so my challenge is that, there are different ways to do it, and not necessarily to follow the herd. This is not pop music, and pop music might kind of be fine and be successful and all these different sort of things, but it doesn't necessarily change the world or your world. And if you want to do different, be different, then you have to be, brave enough to do different things. Now, I use an example in the book to illustrate this, is that there's a company called Coventry Building Society in the UK. They're a financial services organization. They do sort of savings and house loans, mortgages, that type of stuff. And a few years ago, they just went back to basics and just went, oh, we're going to do savings and mortgages. Forget everything else. That's what we do, because that's what we're about. And we're going to focus on doing the right thing at the right time for the right reasons. And we're not going to have any metrics or anything else. We're just going to enable and trust our people to do those sort of things. Here's what happened. They grew at double digits. They were the fastest growing financial services organization before the financial crisis. They still grew at double digits through the financial crisis, and they've grown at double digits since the financial crisis. Now, they're working off a small kind of base, but because they're not big like some of the big sort of retail high street banks or main street banks, but they are an example of what you can do when you're not just enthralled to the metrics. So they don't have sales targets. I mean, they do measure NPS and customer CSAT and that sort of stuff, but they're testament of what you can do when you kind of organize yourself in the right way and do things for the right reasons. And it's just an alternative way of doing things.
Yeah, I feel like a lot of people get caught up in the metrics because they're easy. There's a number, and I can it's easy to understand, right? It's very black and white, but an experience is actually really difficult to quantify. Like when you think about the great experiences that you've had in your life, like that's hard. Like, how do you just put a number to that? That's really difficult. And sometimes we try to do that.
Yeah. So here's the thing is, sometimes I feel like in a slightly heretical way that I wish customer experience as a thing would just go away. Because here's the distinction. There's stuff that happens, and then there's what we make it mean, right? It's the same with customer experience. We cannot control a customer's experience. You take two different kind of people that arrive and have the same sort of experience. You have no control of how much of a shitty day that they've had.
Yeah, right.
And they will experience things in a completely different way. You've done the same thing to the same degree of quality, et cetera, et cetera. They've just experienced it in different ways. We have to understand that fact, that reality. And so we end up having to do, rather than actually focusing on a customer's experience, we have to focus on enabling or doing what we can in order to facilitate them to having a good experience. We cannot guarantee that. And that's why when I say I'm in service to service, that's very intentional. Because I'm not in service to experience, I'm in service to kind of the things that we can do and we can control.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
Right? So I'm in service to my customers and our customers and the customers in general, and employees that serve customers, to try to make those things kind of like better and easier and so on and so forth. But I cannot control how people react to that.
So I wonder.
Sorry, Rob, does that make sense? Because sometimes that's
Yeah,
a bit
does.
esoteric.
No, I don't think it is, but it makes me wonder, and I've asked this question in some different ways with different people, but it makes me wonder, right? Because I think the naming convention is important, that if you think the naming convention of customer experience is problematic, and maybe we should be looking at things a different way, because maybe that changes our mindset and how we're looking at things.
Yeah, and I think that's probably a conversation that's kind of like that's worth having at some point. But it's also a bit like, I guess my question would be is that if we've achieved a common understanding of kind of sort of what sort of space that we're in, I'm not sure that's necessarily a conversation we sort of need to have right now, because everybody's enthusiastic, everybody broadly wants to do the sort of, that has the right sort of intent. It's more about how do we achieve that.
Mm-hmm.
So it's a bit like in the so that's just me kind of a commenting on kind of where things are at and the nature of stuff is, but it's a bit like me, the first track in the book, which is probably one of my favorite tracks of the Punk CX book, was the idea, it was the one that starts with, are you an artist or are you just coloring in? And so if we all agree that we're in here to try and facilitate these better sort of experiences for customers, the analogy around painting by numbers and or creating art is, I think, a useful one, because many people are following the process.
Yeah.
And everybody's doing the same thing and expecting different results. And nobody's really adding that little nuance to it. And this is sort of an idea that I was inspired by. It's definitely the idea of art, and your work is artful, as it were. It's definitely something as a nod to what Seth Godin's kind of talked about in the past. That work is kind of has craft to it, has art to it. I mean, I think people that work in support and service and in contact centers, they are like master craftspeople. Not everybody can do this kind of this work, and so I think we have to celebrate that and respect it, because they are artful people. But I think we need to think about, how do we expand that? How do we celebrate it? How do we enable it?
Mm-hmm. It seems to me, as I reflect upon, I've been in a contact center business for quite some time, and I've heard a lot of people who can hit the process, but the ones that stand out, the ones that make a great experience and add a little magic, are the ones that go through the process with personality and with their own flair and make a human connection. And I think that's the art that you're talking about.
Absolutely. And I think there's that we need to remember that there are people that are dealing with people that have problems. And if you have people that with problems, and if you've got your people that are helping other people kind of solve their problems, that's a real gift. And it is a real skill to do it with calmly and with compassion and empathy and efficiency and all of those sort of things. I mean, the idea to be able to listen to somebody on the phone or to get an email and to be reading it and understanding it and then thinking about what the answer is, and or doing it kind of speaking to somebody on the phone and you're looking up an answer and you're going, oh, okay, here's that, or you're navigating a system to solve a kind of problem. I'm looking at that and just going, that's hardcore. That's proper, right?
Yeah. I tell people all the time, the people that work in contact centers in particular, right? And that's only one part of kind of the larger CX world, but contact centers in particular, a lot of people think of that as kind of a entry level type of, maybe even low skill type of work. And it is anything but that, because
Exactly.
it is very high skill. You have to be adept with computers and different systems and know how to find answers, and sometimes be creative, because sometimes you have to think outside the box to find the answer that you need in a given moment. And, oh, by the way, at the same time, we want you to make a connection with this customer. We want to make sure that you follow a particular process as you're moving throughout the call. Maybe we want you to upsell, or, whatever the case may be.
Sure.
And we want you to be efficient while you're doing this. So, be smart, be friendly, and be fast all the whole way through. And that is not easy, and it's not for everyone.
No, exactly. And I think that I still find it challenging, the logic that goes, and it's an interesting kind of, almost an interesting reflection or indictment of the system that we currently inhabit, the predominant system that we currently inhabit, where if you reflect on the last couple of years, I know that here in the UK, people were going that, the claps for carers type of thing, frontline workers, whether they're, healthcare, delivery drivers, supermarket workers, people in contact centers, all these other things, all the people that were on the front line that kept the wheels on the bus turning, as it were, for all aspects of our sort of lives. And yet we celebrate them for what they've done to help us, allow us to function. But more often than not, those people are some of the hardest working, the most skillful people, but generally some of the people that have to deal with the least number of resources. I know that, and some of the lowest kind of paid in society. So it shows you how our values are sort of like all skews, even though we still talk about, oh, the customer's really important, but we're not really investing in the infrastructure to make that happen.
Yeah, I wonder sometimes how we as customers influence that from from our almost demand for lower prices for whatever it is.
Oh,
And
without a
at
doubt,
this,
that it's without a doubt, it's like that we are. There's I guess there's a reality around human behavior that, in large part, convenience trumps choice every time, and convenience equals faster, cheaper, that sort of stuff, rather than making that sort of conscious choice of like going, I'm willing to pay more. People say they're willing to pay more, but are they really? I mean, are you willing to pay more taxes if that's going to fund a better X, Y, and Z? Are you willing to pay kind of a higher general kind of ticket price if it's going to fund X, Y, and Z? And also, would an organization go, oh, if we can get away with that, are we willing to pay it to there, or do we want to go straight to our shareholders?
Yeah.
You think about, there's an example that I've used, which I love, is there's a guy called Dan Price at Gravity Payments in Seattle or something. Do you know that story? And he read an article by I think it's Peter, no, it's a leading behavioral scientist. Anyway, read this kind of like paper that said that the you only start to achieve diminishing marginal returns in terms of the contribution of money to your own happiness at a point beyond $75,000 US a year. And he was like, brilliant, I'm going to pay everybody in my company a minimum of $70,000 a year. And people, there's commentators in the US, like particularly people like kind of Rush Limbaugh, that was kind of like heard about this one on his radio show or something, was pillorying kind of Dan Price for being a communist, and this is going to be the failing of the kind of the US kind of capitalist system, blah blah blah. And you're like going, oh crumbs, he's just trying to take care of his people. He's like, he just basically said, I don't want my people worried about cost of childcare, if the car is going to make it to work, whatever. I'm going to try and remove all the kind of normal barriers that they would normally face that would people normally kind of like face, and just allow them to bring the best versions of themselves to work.
Yeah.
And guess what? All the metrics, back to metrics, went in the right direction.
Mm-hmm.
Funny that, right?
Yeah. When you take care of your people, it's amazing what can happen then. Mm-hmm. That was, I just answered a question for question of the month for ICMI, and the question was, what metric is most important? And my answer to that was retention. Like, however you measure that, whether it's employee turnover or retention or tenure, average tenure, whatever the case may be, like, that's the number that, if you're going to pay attention to a number, pay attention to that, because that makes a huge difference.
Yeah.
And
particularly right now, there's a guy I had on my podcast a wee while ago, a guy called Nick Webb. He said a properly smart thing. I just thought that's brilliant. He said, look, there's unemployed people right now, and then there's talented people, but there's not many unemployed talented people.
Yeah, it's true. Yeah, it just seems like, right, what Dan was doing was saying, I don't want my people to leave, to find, really, if I pay them enough, they won't think about trying to find another job because they can't pay their bills. They'll just think about doing a good job. And I think that's what he found with Gravity Payments, I think is his company.
Yeah, that's right.
So one of the other topics that really stood out to me in the book that I wanted to talk about was, it came toward the end of the book, and it was a question. And the question was, when's the last time that you sucked at something? So I'd like to explore that a little bit, because I feel like, you've been doing a podcast, obviously, for a very long time. I just started this podcast late last year. And so I felt like very much when I got started with it that I sucked at it. And it was a really challenging experience for me to figure out, how do I make this better? What do I do to make the show more interesting for people? But kind of what was going through your head when you wrote that?
Well, first of all, I need to thank the kind of the graffiti artist that tagged that telephone cabinet in Brighton, where I used to kind of live, that was in the center of town, because that was tagged on the side of a telephone exchange cabinet, and I just thought it was brilliant. So it's like, dude, the first step at kind of getting good at something, sucking at something, is kind of the first step towards getting good at something. And I just thought that was just brilliant. And I think it's a quote from something that somebody's told me. It's a quote from something, a TV program or a cartoon or something. But it made me think about it, is because I think the other thing about all of this sort of stuff is that people talk about, we need to be more agile and adaptable and all these different things. And I sometimes think that we think about that in terms of our projects and how we do things and how we approach stuff, and I go, okay, because then there's that old narrative around fail fast and learn and all that stuff. And I'm like going, are we really failing fast? Because failing fast means that we need to suck at a lot of things, right? And then if it's not just about projects and how we do stuff, but also about individuals. And that's one, being aware of trying new things, taking risks, but then also being comfortable with failing. Because only then, are we honest enough about that, or do we just kind of like brush it aside and things? And so that's why I asked the kind of question is like, when was the last time you sucked at something? Because that's kind of when you kind of learn probably the most. I know that I suck at a lot of things, kind of like a lot of the time. Predominantly around, if I think about work, it's like if I write something, I don't consider myself a natural writer. I think I get better at it as I keep doing more of it. But generally, the first time I draft something out, it's horrible. It's absolutely tragic. And it pains me. It's like this kind of slightly medieval thrashing myself with birch twigs type of approach. That, I mean, it feels like a masochistic endeavor, the kind of writing process for me sometimes. Like whack. It's just, why do I do myself? And why do I do that to myself? And the reason I tell myself is because I like what happens at the end. It feels like I get clarity. I've told a story and go, okay, that's fine. I like that. But sometimes it's really hard work to get to it. And it doesn't make it easy, but it means that, yeah, sure. It's like, and I think it's fun to be aware of those things, but also to try new things. And that might be if you're an individual or you're a team leader or you're something like, maybe you don't actually have to identify those things yourself. Maybe you can actually start a conversation with your people where you say, what did I do last week that I sucked at? Right? Because then you can also transfer that. You can do that kind of like with your people, and you can start get that conversation. But you also do that with your customers. It's a great story. I think it's in the book. It's possibly in a previous book, but I remember talking to a company called it was Casey Smith, who was the CEO and one of the founders of a company called Big Ass Fans. And I love their name. They've got this ass that's kind of like, it's like a donkey's ass, kind of like, and it's looking around kind of thing, and it's like this fan sort of thing, and they make big fans. And the interesting thing is they kind of went out and hired this guy. Casey hired this guy to basically go out and speak to their customers and basically kind of ask them, what do we suck at? But almost really kind of doing it very kind of almost in a gentle way. So taking it really down to the level is like going to the level of going, is there anything that we do, however small, that annoys or irritates you? Because I mean, it's not sucking, it's not a big thing. It could just be just these little things. And they did that. They keep asking, and they don't do it via surveys. They just go out and talk to people, pick up the phone, go and visit them, do all this thing. And they built a team around this guy. Casey said to him, he says, look, your job, you don't work for me. I pay your salary. You don't work for me. You work for our customers. Your job is to go out and find all these things, bring that stuff back to us, and we learn from it. They did that, and they did it relentlessly. Built a team around the guys to do that. They grew their primarily, that's my understanding, primarily they did that, and that was one of the major drivers of their growth over the course of a 5-year period, and their business grew 6-fold in 5 years, driving through that, because they got insight from product design to instructions to delivery to logistics to the order process, all of that sort of stuff. And because they had this dialogue going with the customers, and the customers were like, wow, this is amazing. And they started to talk, and then it kept going, and they got better and better. Across the piece, continuous improvement, cranked up to number 11, Bosch, by staying focused on their customers, by looking for that stuff like, what do we suck at?
It seems like that number one requires a level of, whether I'm asking my customers or I'm asking, people that report to me, which are my customers at that point. But it requires this level of vulnerability to be willing to hear that, to honestly ask that question and be willing to receive the information in a way that says, okay, I want to be constructive with this, and I want to turn what you're giving me around so that I can make that a strength instead of a weakness. And
Yeah.
that's the part I feel like a lot of both individuals and companies really don't want any part of. Like,
Oh, yeah, because that requires all sorts of emotional effort and resilience and all these different sort of things. And, we see that as weakness, and we don't promote kind of like weakness, even though we say we value all of these sort of things. But I also think we also need to kind of recognize that you don't actually have to, it's not as if you're it's not as if you're kind of like everybody's kind of waiting that if you start to ask and then all of a sudden the hose pipe gets turned up and you're like, you're horrible. Ah. Well, no, you might be, but is it likely if you're doing a decent job and you're producing decent returns and things, then you're probably doing okay. And you're just showing a bit of intent, and you can start small. Like, here's what I want to try and do. Start having that conversation. If there's a little thing that you noticed that you bring to my attention that you'd rather I didn't do, or you'd rather, that I changed, then what would it be? And, kind of start kind of small, because like that sort of vulnerability, I think is like, it's like a muscle, and you've got to build that muscle kind of up. And then sometimes that's a muscle that you share with your team and your customers, and because it's part of that relationship. You've got to build that sort of like almost that trusted channel type of dialogue and say, look, I'm asking because I want to do this. I care about what I'm doing. I'm here to help. And I think one of the things that people get caught up in is this idea. It's like irrational fears, right? Interesting thing about some people kind of talk about fear, and they talk about false expectations appearing real. That's what some people say fear, FEAR, what it stands for. It's a bit like if you think about evolution of organizations, and particularly in this sort of space, if you go back, there was a time when people were a bit like, there was a big nervousness about asking customers for feedback, right? There was even a big fear about offering customers 100% money back guarantee.
Yeah.
Like, right? Because people are like going, what happens if everybody could have asked for their money back? You look at it and go, are you stupid? Because if you believe that, then it means that you believe that all your customers are stupid and they don't kind of like value their money, and they don't make very carefully considered kind of choices about what they spend their money on. It's like going, the likelihood of everybody coming and asking for their money back is ridiculous. It's a bit like asking your customers for feedback is if you think you're going to go, all right, it's all about you're going to get a torrent of abuse. You're like going, I think if people were that unhappy, you probably would have heard from them anyway.
Yeah.
Now, I understand it's a survival, fight or flight type of instinct, but sometimes these are just illusions that sit in our heads. And it's the same thing around that being vulnerable and not wanting to open yourself up because you have this false expectation that appears real in your own head. And the only way that you get over that is if you break it down and you can take steps into it. And you build your familiarity with that new sort of domain.
Yeah. I just love that we're talking about that. It's almost like a partnership, right? With my customers. Like I want to, because I think of this too, like with that reporting structure. So if I've got people that are reporting to me and I'm asking them, hey, how can I get better? What do I suck at? Whatever the case may be, that's in the interest of partnership so that I can be a better leader for you. And if it's a company asking their customers, it's in the interest of being a better partner to provide you a product or a service or whatever the case may be.
Yeah.
So that we're all happier at the end.
Yeah. I have this slightly idealistic kind of view that I put in the a book that I wrote back, the How to I one that I mentioned back in 2016, and it's like there's a it's the final word at the back of the book, and it says, I said, I have a dream. It's a dream. A dream is that if we can make all service and experience just a little bit better, a little bit more pleasant for everybody involved, then people will have better days. They'll be less kind of like, they'll be feel less anxious, less kind of like irritable. There'll be less fights, less conflict, less wars, world peace. Amen. Thank you very much. You know, it's very butterfly effect-esque, as it were. But I do think there's an element of that. Some of the work that gets done, particularly in service and support, is important. Like, there was some shocking research that came out, I think it was last year. I think it was from Pega. And they found out that, was it 10% of customers had cried after an interaction with an organization, right? And they cried, and it completely ruined their day. 10%. Now,
That's crazy.
That's a crazy number of people that are just being and can't get the thing, and then it's ruined their day. And that's just wrong. But here's the thing: it's like what we haven't actually talked about is like going, if there's 10% of customers that have felt that way, I'm pretty sure there's probably a similar number of people that are trying to help customers that have probably felt the same level of frustration and disappointment that they haven't been able to help. And so you get it on both sides. And I think the thing is, it's like, you know, if a picture of a crying customer is not enough to motivate you to step into some of this sort of stuff and to do the hard, but possibly knotty and possibly uncomfortable kind of like work, then I don't know what to say to you.
Yeah. Well, I'm glad that you keep asking questions and posing those questions for all of us, because I know that the people that are listening and paying attention are thinking about this, and they're being inspired and making whatever changes they can make in their own organization. So I have to tell you that I really appreciate what you're putting out there, because I remember the day, because it only took me a day to read the book because it's that fast, not even a full day. But I remarked multiple times to my wife, I'm like, hey, listen to this, right? And she's like, oh, wow, I really love that, right? So those questions are important. They get people thinking, and you know, if we're all thinking about it, then we can make those little increments of positivity and make everything a little bit better for everyone else.
Absolutely. And Rob, can I just say thank you for the work that you do. Thank you for the podcast and spreading the word and your own level of advocacy and agitation. Thank you for asking me to come and share a few musings kind of with you. But also thank you to everybody that's listening, because and all your colleagues that are out there, because you are the heroes in my book. You do great work. Just keep doing the great works, and like, you're like high performance athletes. High performance athletes don't go from, you know, finishing last to finishing first overnight. It doesn't happen that way. It's all about these kind of incremental kind of gains and trying new things and, you know, exploring new kind of avenues, because that's what performance is. Performance is a habit, but it's a habit about trying new things, trying different things, but also looking for different and looking for better. And that's all I'm asking for people to do, is to be always looking for different and better. That doesn't mean to say you should discard the things that work. No, but you should look for work and things can be better. So you end up collecting a set of habits that will drive your team and your organization's performance kind of onwards. But I say this to you, it's like I salute you all, because I think the work that you do matters and it's important. So thank you.
Great words. Thank you, Adrian, for joining us here on Next in Queue. Appreciate your time today.